Jake Harper sat at the helm of his starship, his fingers brushing over the controls in a rhythm he had long mastered. The engine hummed beneath his feet as the ship glided silently through the vast emptiness of space. He had spent the last few years traveling alone, ever since the day the scar on his face became a permanent reminder of a battle he had barely survived. The scar ran from his left cheek down to his jaw, a brutal, jagged line that had been a symbol of his past and the things he had lost. He had been a captain, a warrior for the Galactic Union, fighting in wars against the Sci-Fi. They were a ruthless species, their eyes glowing with an unholy light, their technology far more advanced than anything humanity had ever encountered. Jake had fought with everything he had, but even with all his experience, he'd barely managed to escape a battle on a forgotten planet deep in Sci-Fi space. That was where he had gotten the scar, where he had lost the crew that had once looked to him for leadership. Since then, Jake had kept to the outskirts of known space, taking on menial jobs, doing what he could to survive while leaving the past behind. His ship, the Elysian, was a simple vessel, built for efficiency, not luxury. It was just him and the ship now, no crew, no friends, just a man trying to escape his demons. He didn't need anything or anyone else, or so he thought. Today, however, was different. As the Elysian drifted near the edge of the galaxy, a sense of unease settled over him. It wasn't the usual feeling he had when encountering the unknown. It was something deeper, like an invisible hand pressing against his chest, a warning he couldn't ignore. Jake's eyes narrowed as the ship's sensors began to pick up an anomaly. At first, it was a slight distortion, barely noticeable. Then the signal grew stronger. "What in the hell?" Jake muttered, adjusting the controls, trying to get a clearer reading. He wasn't alone out here. The ship's radar blinked to life, showing an unidentified vessel approaching at high speed. Its shape was sleek, almost elegant, with a design that didn't match any known species in the galaxy. It was as though it had been crafted with purpose, each curve and edge suggesting a force beyond his understanding. There was no time to waste. Jake's instincts kicked in. He immediately powered up the ship's defenses, preparing for a confrontation. But the unknown vessel didn't fire on him. Instead, it matched the speed of the Elysian, staying close but not threatening. Jake's hand hovered over the weapons system, but he held back. Whoever or whatever was on that ship wasn't here to fight. Not yet, at least. "Show yourself," Jake called out over the comms, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his bones. He waited for a response, but all he received was silence. Then, without warning, the ship's hatch opened, and a figure stepped onto the hull of the Elysian, effortlessly defying gravity in the vacuum of space. The figure was a woman, dressed in a silver suit that shimmered under the light of the distant stars. Her presence was commanding, yet her movements were graceful, almost ethereal. She was human, or at least looked human. Her features were sharp, her face elegant, with eyes that shimmered with an unnatural light. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the figure floated toward him, her eyes never leaving him as she drew closer. It wasn't fear that gripped him, but something much deeper. He felt as if she was searching for something only he could provide. When she reached the cockpit, she didn't speak at first. She simply stared at him, her gaze locked on the scar across his face. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something in her eyes, a recognition, a knowing, as though she understood something about him that he didn't. The silence between them stretched, and Jake felt an uncomfortable weight in the air. His pulse quickened. He wasn't used to strangers, especially ones that seemed to have some strange connection to him. His hand instinctively moved to his sidearm, but he stopped himself. She hadn't made any aggressive moves, and that alone was enough to hold his action. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice soft but firm, carrying an air of certainty. "You're the one I've been seeking," she whispered. Jake blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. The words hung in the air like an unspoken promise, and for a moment he couldn't find his voice. "What do you mean?" he finally asked, his words coming out slower than he intended. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes still fixed on him, tracing the scar on his face as though she were studying a piece of ancient history. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, she said, "Your scar, it's a mark of destiny." Jake stiffened. His past was full of scars, both physical and emotional, but this woman seemed to know something about it that even he didn't understand. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake replied, his voice betraying a slight edge of frustration. The woman's gaze softened. You're not just anyone, Jake Harper. You were chosen long before you were born. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. Chosen? What was she talking about? He was no one special, just a soldier who had barely escaped with his life after the Sci-Fi nearly wiped out his crew. He was a man marked by failure, not a hero, not someone who was chosen. But the way she looked at him, the way she spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that she believed every word. Her eyes were filled with a quiet intensity, as if she had been waiting for him for a long time. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with both suspicion and curiosity. The woman smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm Leora, and I've been searching for you for years." Jake's mind raced, searching for him, but why? He barely understood what she was saying. He had no idea who she was, yet there was something about her, something undeniable, that made him want to believe her. Leora took a step back and looked toward the ship's control panel. "We don't have much time. The Zyphar are already aware of your presence. We need to leave now, or they'll find us before we can escape." The mention of the Zyphar sent a cold shiver through Jake's spine. He had known that one day he would have to face them again, but not like this. Not with some mysterious woman appearing out of nowhere, claiming that he was the one she had been seeking. Jake glanced at the ship's radar. It was too late to escape. The Zyphar were closing in. "Get on board," he said, his voice decisive. "We'll talk on the way." Leora gave a small nod, and without another word, she moved to the hatch. Jake followed her, his mind still spinning with questions he couldn't answer. He didn't know what she was after, but he knew one thing for sure: his life was about to change. As they made their way to the ship's cockpit, Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze on him. There was something about her, something that made him feel like he was a part of something far bigger than himself. He didn't know how or why, but he had a feeling that this strange encounter was only the beginning of a journey that would lead him to answers he had never even dreamed of. And as the hatch sealed behind them, the stars outside the Elysian began to blur, and Jake felt a shiver of anticipation run through him. The adventure had just begun. Jake sat in the cockpit of the Elysian, his hands resting on the controls. His mind was in a whirl of confusion and disbelief. The events of the past few hours had left him with more questions than answers. Who was Leora? Why had she come for him? And why did she say he was the one? As the ship made its way through the galaxy, Leora remained quiet, her presence oddly calming yet unsettling. She had been a mystery ever since she stepped onto his ship. Everything about her, the way she moved, the way she spoke, seemed to suggest that she knew something he didn't. It wasn't just her words, but the way she looked at him, like she had been waiting for him her whole life. Jake glanced over at her. She sat across from him, her eyes closed as if lost in thought. The faint glow from the ship's control panels cast shadows on her face, highlighting the calm, almost serene expression she wore. There was something undeniably captivating about her. But beneath that calm, Jake could sense a quiet intensity. Finally, Leora spoke, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but full of purpose, as though every word she said carried the weight of something much larger than the moment. "I know you're confused," she said, her eyes opening and locking onto Jake's. "But you're not alone in this. I've been searching for you for a long time." Jake shifted in his seat, not sure how to respond. He had heard the words before, but hearing them again felt different now. It wasn't just a casual statement. Leora's tone was filled with a kind of certainty that made him feel as though she truly believed what she was saying. "Why me?" Jake asked, his voice steady, though a knot of unease tightened in his chest. "What makes me so special?" Leora's expression softened. She leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You're not just anyone, Jake. You were chosen before you were born. Your destiny is tied to something far greater than anything you've ever imagined." Jake shook his head, still trying to process her words. "Destiny? Chosen? Leora, I'm just a man who's been through hell and barely made it out alive. I'm no hero." Leora's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no mockery in it. "You don't see it yet, but you are more than you think. You carry something within you, something that was left behind by your ancestors. And the scar on your face, it's not just a wound. It's a mark of what you are capable of." Jake felt a chill creep up his spine as Leora's words sank in. He had always seen his scar as a reminder of his past mistakes, of the lives lost in the battle against the Zyphar. It was a symbol of everything he had failed to protect. But now, hearing Leora speak about it in such a different way made him wonder if he had been wrong all along. "The scar," he whispered, his hand instinctively moving to touch it. What does it mean? Leora nodded. It's a mark of your connection to the Ashara, an ancient race that once ruled the galaxy. They were a peaceful people, but they were nearly wiped out by the Sci-Fi, who sought to take control of their technology and their knowledge. The Ashara knew of a weapon that could defeat the Sci-Fi once and for all, but they couldn't use it. They needed someone like you, someone with the bloodline of both the Ashara and humanity. Jake blinked, his mind racing to process the words. The Ashara. A weapon that could defeat the Sci-Fi, his bloodline, this was all too much to take in. I'm human, Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. I don't have anything to do with an ancient race. I'm not what you think I am. Leora's gaze softened as she leaned forward. You are human, yes, but your ancestors were not. The Ashara blood flows through your veins, Jake. You just don't know it yet. Your family's past has been hidden for centuries, but the time has come for you to awaken what has been buried inside you. Jake's mind spun as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. Could it be true? Could his family have been part of an ancient race? He didn't know. He didn't remember any of it. All he had were the scars, the memories of battles long past, and a feeling of emptiness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Leora stood up and walked toward the rear of the ship, where a small, locked compartment sat against the wall. She opened it without hesitation, revealing a series of ancient artifacts, each one carefully placed inside. The artifacts glowed faintly, their designs intricate and foreign. These are the remnants of the Ashara, Leora said, her voice reverent. And they're the key to unlocking your true potential, but we can't just jump into it. We need to find the location of the weapon first. Without it, all of this is meaningless. Jake followed her to the compartment, his curiosity growing. The weapon? He asked, his mind now focused on the one thing that had always been at the forefront of his thoughts. The Sci-Fi. Leora nodded. The weapon is what can end the Sci-Fi's reign of terror. It's not just a tool of destruction, it's a force of balance. It will bring peace to the galaxy, but only if we find it before the Sci-Fi do. She turned to him, her expression serious. And that's why I need you, Jake. I've been looking for you because you are the one who can wield it. You're the key. Jake felt the weight of her words press down on him. He had never asked for any of this. All he wanted was to be left alone to escape the ghosts of his past. But now, standing before him, was the woman who had been searching for him, telling him that his life was part of something much bigger than he could ever have imagined. I'm not sure I'm ready for this, Jake said, his voice low. Leora gave him a small, understanding smile. You may not feel ready, but you don't need to be. The Ashara blood inside you has been waiting for this moment. It's in you, Jake. All you need to do is accept it. Jake turned away, his gaze fixed on the stars outside the ship. The weight of the galaxy seemed to press down on him, and for the first time he felt small, insignificant. But in that moment, something within him stirred. Maybe Leora was right. Maybe his past wasn't just full of failure, it was full of purpose. You said the Sci-Fi were closing in, Jake said, his voice steadying. How much time do we have? Leora's expression hardened. Not much. They've already located your ship. We need to act quickly. The weapon is hidden in an ancient star system far from here. But the Sci-Fi are relentless. If they get to it first, they'll use it to destroy everything, Jake finished for her. Leora nodded gravely. Exactly, and that's why we can't waste any more time. Jake turned back to her, determination flickering in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something that could change everything. It wasn't the quiet life he had been seeking, but maybe, just maybe, it was something worth fighting for. Let's find the weapon, Jake said, his voice full of resolve. Leora's eyes softened with approval. We're not just finding the weapon, Jake, we're saving the galaxy. With that, the Elysian shifted its course, racing toward the unknown. The stars outside the ship stretched into streaks of light as they hurtled through the galaxy, heading toward the ancient star system that held the key to their future and the galaxy's survival. As they flew into the vastness of space, Jake couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. But one thing was clear. Whatever the future held, he was no longer alone. Jake gripped the controls of the Elysian, his fingers feeling the smooth surface as the ship raced toward the ancient star system that held the weapon. The stars outside blurred into streaks, and the deep hum of the engines filled the silence of the cockpit. He could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach. The Sci-Fi were getting closer, and every minute that passed brought them one step closer to the weapon that could tip the balance of the galaxy. Beside him, Leora sat calmly, her eyes fixed on the readouts in front of her. She had been quiet for the past few hours, her mind clearly focused on the mission ahead. Jake couldn't help but admire her composure. There was a quiet strength in her, something he hadn't fully understood until now. She wasn't just a mysterious woman who had appeared out of nowhere. She was the key to everything. Jake's thoughts drifted back to the revelations she had shared with him. The Ashara bloodline, his ancestors, the weapon that could change everything. He had never believed in destiny. He had always thought of himself as just a man trying to survive, a man with nothing more than a scar to remind him of his failures. But now, everything was different. Now he had a purpose. The ship jolted slightly as they passed through a cluster of asteroids. Jake's focus snapped back to the task at hand. He had to keep his mind sharp. They were nearing the star system, and the Sci-Fi would be close behind. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his head. Leora nodded without looking at him. "I know, the weapon is close, but the Sci-Fi won't make it easy for us." Jake knew that. The Sci-Fi were relentless. He had faced them before, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But this time, it was different. This time, he had something they didn't. He had the knowledge of the Ashara, and he had Leora by his side. As the Elysian approached the ancient star system, the stars around them began to dim, replaced by the cold blackness of a long-forgotten void. The system was old, so old, in fact, that even the maps had lost track of it. It was hidden, lost to time, and that was exactly why it had become the last hope for those who sought to defeat the Sci-Fi. Leora's voice broke the silence. "The weapon is on the fourth planet. It's hidden deep beneath the surface, in a structure built by the Ashara themselves. But the Sci-Fi have likely already set up a perimeter. We'll have to fight our way through." Jake nodded, his hands tightening on the controls. The thought of a fight didn't bother him. It was what he did. But this time, it felt different. This time, he wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. He was fighting for the future of the galaxy. As the planet came into view, Jake could see the faint outline of a massive structure on the surface. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a vast, intricate building that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. It was clear that the Ashara had built it to withstand the most powerful forces, but would it be enough to protect the weapon? "We need to land on the surface," Jake said, his voice resolute. "Prepare yourself, Leora, we're going in." Leora didn't say anything. She simply nodded and stood up, her movements fluid and purposeful. She had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Jake had no doubt she was ready. The ship descended through the atmosphere, the air growing thicker as they neared the surface. Jake could see the lights of the Sci-Fi ships already circling the planet, waiting for them to arrive. They knew they were coming, and they were prepared for a fight. Jake set the ship down in a clearing near the ancient structure. The landing was smooth, but the tension in the air was palpable. The time for words had passed. Now it was time for action. "We go in fast," Jake said, glancing over at Leora. "We get to the weapon before the Sci-Fi do, or we don't make it out." Leora gave him a small, grim smile. "I know, let's move." The two of them quickly exited the ship, weapons in hand. The ground beneath their feet was rocky and uneven, the air thick with the scent of ancient dust. The structure loomed ahead, its dark silhouette against the dimming sky. As they approached the entrance, Jake could see movement in the distance. The Sci-Fi were already here. He could make out the dark shapes of their soldiers moving through the ruins, preparing for an assault. "We're not alone," Jake said, his voice low. Leora's eyes flickered to the horizon, where the shadows of the Sci-Fi were growing clearer. "We never were." Jake didn't respond. Instead, he quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. They had no time to waste. The weapon was the only thing that could stop the Sci-Fi, and it was their last hope. As they neared the entrance of the structure, Jake could feel the ground vibrating beneath his feet. The Ashara had built this place to withstand centuries of wear and tear, but now it was about to face its greatest test. They reached the entrance and slipped inside, the cold air of the inner chambers welcoming them. The walls were lined with ancient symbols, their meanings lost to time. But Jake didn't have the luxury of deciphering them now. He had a mission to complete. The corridors inside were narrow, the air stale, as if the place had been abandoned for millennia. But despite the age of the structure, it still hummed with energy. Jake could feel it, a pulse, a thrum that seemed to come from the very heart of the building. "We're close," Leora said, her voice echoing through the dark halls. The weapon is just ahead. Jake nodded, his hand tightening on the hilt of his weapon. They moved through the corridors with speed and purpose, but they weren't alone. The Sci-Fi had followed them into the structure, and now they were closing in. Jake could hear the unmistakable sound of their boots on the stone floor, their voices low and threatening. "Stay close," Jake whispered to Leora. "We need to move fast." Leora nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. She wasn't afraid, neither was Jake. They had come too far to turn back now. As they rounded the corner, they saw the chamber ahead. It was vast, its ceiling lost in the shadows above. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it, glowing with an eerie light, was the weapon. It was a device unlike anything Jake had ever seen, beautiful and terrifying all at once. Its surface was smooth, covered in intricate markings, and it pulsed with energy. Jake took a step forward, but before he could reach the pedestal, the Sci-Fi appeared. They emerged from the shadows, their weapons drawn and ready for battle. "This is as far as you go, human," one of the Sci-Fi soldiers hissed, his voice cold and menacing. Jake didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon and fired, the blast sending one of the Sci-Fi soldiers tumbling backward. Leora moved with lightning speed, taking out another soldier with a swift strike. But there were too many of them. Jake and Leora were outnumbered, and the Sci-Fi were relentless. Jake knew they couldn't keep fighting forever. Then something changed. The scar on Jake's face, the one that had haunted him for so long, began to burn with an intense heat. He felt the energy coursing through his veins, a power unlike anything he had ever experienced. It was the power of the Ashara, the bloodline he had never known he carried. He raised his hands, and the air around him seemed to shimmer. The ground beneath their feet trembled as the weapon on the pedestal began to glow brighter. Jake could feel it. He was connected to it now, as if it had awakened something deep inside him. With a roar, Jake unleashed the power within him. A wave of energy surged through the room, knocking the Sci-Fi soldiers off their feet. The walls shook, and the entire structure seemed to come alive with energy. The Sci-Fi tried to fight back, but they were no match for the power Jake now commanded. The weapon on the pedestal hummed with energy, and Jake knew it was time. He stepped forward and placed his hands on the device, feeling the power surge through him. The energy flooded his body, and he knew what he had to do. With a final, decisive push, Jake activated the weapon. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the device, and the Sci-Fi were consumed by it. The room was filled with a blinding brilliance, and Jake felt the power of the weapon reach its peak. The Sci-Fi were no more. As the light faded, Jake collapsed to his knees, his body exhausted from the strain. Leora was beside him in an instant, her hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Jake looked up at her, a weary smile on his face. "We did it." The weapon had worked. The Sci-Fi were gone. The galaxy was safe for now, but Jake knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. He had a purpose now. And with Leora by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. As they stood in the silence of the chamber, Jake looked out at the stars, knowing that their journey had only just begun.